Well, good evening. It is 6:30, and welcome to everybody here in the room, and welcome to folks online. And we figured out what our problem was the last 2 weeks, why we got cut off about the last 10 minutes of the last couple of sessions, is the camera we were using, which was a GoPro. I guess after about an hour and 15 minutes, it overheats. And when it overheats, it turns itself off. And so that's what happened the last couple of weeks. But fortunately, both times it was only about the last 10 minutes. And so didn't miss a whole bunch. And what we talked about last week, I'm going to kind of re-go over or, cover it one more time as we begin tonight. So thanks for your patience. I know it's frustrating, especially if it's mid-sentence and it just goes dark. But, technology is so wonderful as long as it works. And when it doesn't work, it can be real frustrating. But that's why we couldn't figure out what was wrong, because we tested it at work. We just didn't test it for an hour and a half where it would overheat. So it looks a little bit different, and this is my own phone that apparently does just about as good a job, and with a mic hook up to it. So welcome again. We are looking at Paul's first letter to the people of Corinth, and we had just sort of finished chapter 6 last week and started to look at chapter 7. And that's where I want to pick up with chapter 7, because it's an involved conversation that Paul has all through chapter 7 on the topic of marriage. After he dealt with some other topics, and this is the part of the letter that is his responses to what he's heard about what's going on in Corinth and how he is answering some of the challenges and problems that they have. Before we kind of revisit what he has to say about marriage, let's think about Paul and his own situation and the perspective that he's coming from. We don't know how old Paul is at the point that he writes this. Certainly he's an established person. Certainly he has, by his own definition, he has been a Pharisee. He's trained under Gamaliel, the great rabbi of that era. He is single. And that is, frankly, unusual for a Pharisee to be single, because all the Pharisees were married. In Judaism, it was considered mandatory for men to marry. Some of the Jewish rabbis would say that if a man was not married, he was not fulfilling one of the great commandments of God, which was to go forth, be fruitful, and multiply. Not only to be married, but to produce children. Men who were not married were just not considered to be in the Sanhedrin, or to be elders, or to be rabbis, or to be teachers. And the Pharisees, all the Pharisees that we know of, were married. So we almost need to conclude that Paul was probably one of two things. Either Paul was a widower who had lost his wife at some point earlier in his life, but he doesn't ever refer to that, or his conversion to Christianity caused his wife to leave him. Those are both theories that scholars have, because it is highly unlikely that he was a single man. So he's probably either a widower or someone whose wife, when he had this radical life change, it ended his marriage. Now we don't, as I say, do we know in either of those things for fact? He never references that, but we just know historically it would be highly unusual for a man who considered himself a Pharisee to be single. So that's one part of Paul's profile. The other thing we have to realize in this entire 1 Corinthians letter is that Paul is a man who is a pastor and a missionary who considers that he is living in the end times, the last days. When Jesus ascended back to the Father, and after the 40 days after the resurrection, on Ascension Day, it says the apostles were just watching him until he disappeared from sight. And two angels came to the apostles and said, men of Galilee, why are you staring at the clouds? This same Jesus who has left will return in the same way. And they certainly believe that. We believe that. But they thought that meant very quickly, very soon, certainly within their lifetimes. So the early church, especially for the first, let's say, 20, 30 years of the early church, from 33, the time of Jesus' death and resurrection, until at least well into the 50s and maybe even the early 60s, the church was thinking Jesus is going to return any time. The second coming is imminent. And they lived with that sort of anticipation for those first 20 or 30 years. You see this in Paul's letters, because when we line up Paul's letters chronologically, and remember, the Bible doesn't arrange things chronologically. The Old Testament is not chronological. The New Testament is not chronological. The Old Testament, one reason in the Old Testament you jump back and forth in the prophets from, the 7th century BC to the 5th century BC to the 8th century BC, and back and forth and back and forth. The reason that you keep jumping back and forth chronologically in the Old Testament is the Old Testament prophets are arranged not chronologically, but by the length of the book. The longer books come first, the shorter books come later. And we think, well, they should do it a different way. Well, our Western way of thinking thinks that it should be chronological. Their Eastern way of thinking thinks, no, you should have the larger books at the front and the smaller books at the back. And so it's frustrating for us sometimes as you're reading through, let's say, especially the prophets, to be jumping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, the same way with Paul's letters. The first letter of Paul in the New Testament is what? Right after the book of Acts. It's Romans. Why? Because it's the longest letter. Romans is in there first because it's the longest letter. It's not the earliest letter. It's the longest letter. And the ones at the end are the very short ones, like Philemon and the letters to Timothy, etc. So they're not arranged chronologically. So 1 Corinthians is a letter from early in Paul's ministry, when Paul is convinced that Jesus' return to earth and the day, what they would call the day of the Lord, is coming quick. In his later writings, if we were to put Paul's letters in a chronological order instead of in a length of letter order, in his later letters, say that 3 times fast, in his later letters, you see him take a much different tone, especially as it relates to things like marriage. And I'll point that out, but his comments on marriage here in chapter 7 are definitely impacted by the fact that he felt that the church was living in the end times. And we, at least, we often hear about groups today that say, this is the day of Jesus' return. This is the day it's going to happen. Some of those groups, some of those groups that believe that they have ascertained or God has revealed to them or through their study of the Bible, they've come and say, well, this is the day that Jesus is coming back. You've heard stories about those folks. What are some of the things they do when they're convinced that this is the end of the line and that Jesus' return is imminent? What do some of those folks do? Yeah, they quit their jobs. They sell everything. They sometimes write a book. But their whole lifestyle changes when they're convinced that the time before the return of Christ and the so-called second coming is only weeks or months away. It radically changes their behavior. And so far, every one of those groups has been wrong. There was a great number of folks right around the turn of the millennium, right around the year 2000, who thought, well, that's going to be it. The year 2000, that's going to be the second coming. Of course, if they read scholarship, they would say, well, actually, scholars believe, based on the census that Luke refers to and all that in the beginning chapters of Luke, and comparing that with other historical documents, we believe Jesus was probably born between 4 and 7 BC. You say, wait a minute, how could Jesus be born between 4 and 7 BC before Christ? Well, that just means that we got the year wrong. When they started dating time from the birth of Christ, that wasn't until the 4th century. And they started to try to figure out how long had it been since Jesus was born, and they came up with a number. and they didn't have the access to historical documents of the Roman Empire and other things that we have gotten in later years. All that to say, Jesus was probably born somewhere around 6 or 7 BC, which meant if you were thinking Jesus' return would be in the year 2,000 years after his birth, it meant it would have been 1993 or something like that. Does that all make sense when I say that Jesus wasn't born in the year 1? Probably. Some of that correlates with planets converging to form what looked to be a new star in the sky, and astrologers and astronomers have calculated when that occurrence would have happened, which may have been the Star of Bethlehem. But mainly when we know about the census that is mentioned in the book of Luke about Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and they called a census, etc. When you correlate all the historical data, we know that Jesus was probably born a few years before the people in the 4th century thought he was. All that to say, everybody who makes a prediction about the second coming for the last 2,000 years has gotten it wrong. I've mentioned before there was a book published by a Christian publisher in 1985, 86. The title of the book was 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988. And he listed 88 reasons why he was confident that the second coming would be in 1988. And he sold a lot of books. And 1988 came, and 1988 turned to 1989, and those books all went into the bargain bin at the bookstores. And that has happened over and over and over and over again. There was a huge feeling that Jesus would return at the year 1000, at the first turn of the millennium, 1,000 years ago. Anyway, everybody so far has been wrong about that. But you can see how Paul and others in the first century felt like at first they couldn't imagine that Jesus would take so long to return. And so when we read Paul's comments here about marriage and other things, you just have to realize he believes they in the first century are living on borrowed time. The time is short. Jesus' return is imminent. And that impacts all of your relationships, including marriage. And that's why he seems to be so negative about marriage in this chapter. It seems like he's kind of like, well, get married if you have to. If you can't control yourself, if you can't control your lust, well, go ahead and get married if you must. But the single life, the celibate life, is superior. And that's why, as I said, I started on this last time, but let's just look at it real quick on 7:1. Matters you wrote about. It's good for a man not to marry. But since there's so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, each woman should have her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body doesn't belong to her alone, but also to her husband. Same way the husband's body doesn't belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Don't deprive each other, except by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So he's kind of saying, well, get married if you just can't control yourselves. And then he says, something really kind of, for his day and for his time, every man would agree that the woman's body belonged to him, but they wouldn't necessarily say the converse, that his body belongs to her. That was a pretty feminist idea in the first century, that there was that was mutual, not just a man having his rights, because in many cultures, including Judaism, the woman was really considered the property of the husband in many ways. So he says, verse 6, I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am. In other words, single. But each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, one other has that. And by gift, we talked about the gift of celibacy, of a celibate life, which, so many teenage boys would go, God, don't give me that gift. I don't want that gift. He says, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it's good for them to stay unmarried as I am. But if they can't control themselves, they should marry. It's better to marry than to burn with passion. So just not a ringing endorsement of marriage here. It doesn't sound like he's like, yay, marriage. It sounds like, well, okay, if you must. But it's because he is saying, one, why would you get married when Jesus is going to be coming back anytime? And he is a, single-minded person. I mean, he is totally devoted to his mission. That's one reason he has such an effective ministry, is he is so devoted. He didn't have time, really, for a wife, given his schedule of constantly being on the move, going from town to town, preaching. It did not fit for him to have a wife. You know who else it didn't fit to have a wife? John Wesley. John Wesley, who is our founder as Methodist, John Wesley, the one who really began the Methodist movement, first as a college group at Oxford, and then as he started to preach to the poor in the streets, in the fields of England, and started the Methodist societies, and would go from town to town preaching and forming these little study groups, these little discipleship groups, which Wesley did for 45, 50 years. He was constantly on the go. Wesley, in his middle years, married a widow. He was never home. She left him. Wesley's wife left him with good reason, because he was never home. He never was with her. And she grew tired of sitting alone. So Wesley was not good at marriage. Wesley should have never married, given his drive, given his single-mindedness of the Methodist movement. And that's what Paul is like as well. Verse 10, to the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. If she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. Remember, here he's quoting Jesus. Jesus really condemns divorce. Jesus says if you divorce for any reason other than infidelity, you're committing adultery. And so here he's holding the same line that Jesus held, which is, divorce is counter to the teachings of Christ. Now, side path here. Divorce is always tragic. Sometimes staying in a marriage is more tragic. I mean, there are some marriages that are abusive. I mean, that don't necessarily involve infidelity, but they involve abuse, and they involve other things that are intolerable. And, I've had, over my years as a pastor, I've had, a lot of folks come to me, basically as the representative of the church, or, seeing me as somebody who would be able to speak from Scripture, kind of saying, this is the situation in my marriage, it's abusive, and et cetera, but they knew that the Bible and Jesus are saying divorce is also a bad thing, and they're kind of looking for what do I do? And I what I tend to say is I lean back on Martin Luther, believe it or not. Because Martin Luther has a famous quote, at least famous to those of us who've kind of studied theologians. Luther says there are those situations where no matter what you do, there's some sin involved. Like, let's say, the classic modern example is you're in Poland, it's 1939, you're a Christian, and you're hiding your Jewish neighbors in your basement. Nazis come to your door. Are you hiding any Jews? What do? You lie. You lie like a dog. You lie. Well, lying is a sin. But turning your neighbors over to the gas chamber would be a much greater sin. And in those situations, Luther says, when you have the choice between two sins, you have to weigh, and then he says when you realize that one of them, in that case, say lying, is the more life-affirming, the life-giving, the better path, he says in those choices, he says, sin and sin boldly, which is a weird quote from somebody like Martin Luther. But basically, there is those times where Luther says, if you got a fork in the road, and neither one of them is a good path. In those cases, you have to choose the least harmful path, in other words. So that's a side path about, Larry, why would you marry people who've been divorced? Why would you do a wedding for divorced people, which I've done multiple times? Because sometimes divorce is the less sinful alternative to a marriage where there is abusive and bad things happen. So anyway, but he says here, don't separate. And he says a husband must not divorce his wife. Again, remember, in this Jewish culture, it's so different from our culture. Men had absolute power. For a man to divorce his wife, all he had to say was, I'm tired of you. As I said, literally one of the rabbis said if she put too much salt in the stew, that was grounds for divorce. And all he had to do was say, he had to write a letter that said, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. 3 times, and hand it to her, and they were done. And she's out on the streets with no support, with nothing. And she can't go down to the employment agency and get a job in that culture unless she has family that's going to take care of her. Her job prospects are very limited, often prostitution being the only one that is available to her. So anyway, all that. So divorce is a very one-sided thing in the Jewish culture and in most cultures 2,000 years ago. So, to the rest of this I say, I, not the Lord. Notice here Paul continually differentiates between this is what I think that God is saying, and this is what I'm saying. Again, people who take every word of the Bible as a dictation of God have not read the Bible. Because here's clearly Paul saying, this is not God saying this is me saying this. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord, if any brother has a wife who's not a believer, and she's willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. If a woman has a husband who's not a believer, and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. So, this is a situation that was a very real situation in Corinth. You've got a married couple, one of them becomes a Christian, the other one doesn't. What do you do? He's like, so the Christian, they're writing Paul and saying, Paul, I've become a Christian, but my wife is like, nuh-uh, or vice versa. Paul, I've become a Christian, my husband is like, no way. Do we leave him? Do we divorce? Do we end? Do I leave him? Do I leave her? Do I divorce her? And Paul is saying, no. No. He says, for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, as it is they're holy. Now this is, okay, we have to be careful here. Well, what is he saying? I don't think he's saying if you're married to a Christian, you get co-opted into, you're by default a Christian as well. I don't think he's saying that. I think he's saying, there's always the possibility that your witness and your grace and your faith will eventually win your spouse over. And, this to separate is not good for your children. And for them to be raised in a Christian environment. I think he's just saying, never give up unless there's infidelity, unless there's a reason. He then says, but, verse 15, if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such a circumstance. So, if you're a Christian and your wife or husband is not, and they go, well, I can't put up with this whole Christianity stuff, and they leave, he's like, you got to let them go. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you'll save your husband? How do you know, husband, whether you'll save your wife? And of course, this is not just an issue in Corinth in the first century. this is an issue in the world every century since. And when I do premarital counseling with couples who are engaged, I mean, one of the things we need to talk about is if one of them is a Christian, the other one isn't. What does that mean for the marriage? What does that mean? How are you going to raise your kids if you have kids? What does that mean? It right off the bat presents a big challenge to a marriage if one spouse is a Christian and the other one isn't. One of the early weddings I did when I was only been a pastor for a couple of years, I had one of my close friends from high school. They always said, once I went to seminary, some of my high school friends were like, oh, if I ever get married, I want you to do the wedding, And I ended up doing 3 or 4 of those weddings for high school friends. But this friend, he was marrying a Jewish girl. And that's a whole other story, because I did the wedding with a rabbi, and that was, oy vey, that was quite a wedding. But one of the things that they knew up front, and which I talked to them up front, is when you come from 2 different religious backgrounds, what's going to happen when you have kids, and how what do you say about Jesus when one person believes he's the Messiah and the Savior of the world, and the other one believes, well, he was maybe a decent teacher and rabbi, but that's all he was. I mean, how do you reconcile all of that? So he's saying, stay married if possible, because you never know. You can win your wife or win your husband, but if they are determined to leave, there's not much you can do about it. Anyway, so verse 17. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down for all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He shouldn't become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He shouldn't be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Now you might say, now wait a minute. How do you reverse circumcision? If you think, well, if circumcision is, especially first century surgical technique, not to be graphic, but once you've cut off the foreskin of the penis, it's pretty hard to reattach that, especially in first century. So what does he mean? Well, shorthand. The uncircumcised are the Gentiles. The circumcised are the Jews. Okay? So the term, the circumcised, is just a blanket term for Judaism. And uncircumcised is a blanket term for Gentiles. So that happens not just in this letter, but in other places in the scriptures, where someone will be talking about someone traveling into some other territory. Are you going to go live among the uncircumcised? Well, that just means, are you going to go live with Gentiles? So etc. So this is not to be taken that literally. This is just a different way to talk about Gentile and Jew. But what he's saying is, if you're a Jewish Christian, you're a Jewish Christian. If you're a Gentile Christian, you're a Gentile Christian. Don't try, if you're a Jewish Christian, don't suddenly try to become Gentile. If you're a Gentile Christian, don't suddenly try to become Jewish. Just, that's who you are. You enter into Christianity from different places. And, when they had the debate about, and we're going to get into this more in this book, or this letter, how Jewish does a Gentile have to be a Christian? That's one of the great debates of the first century. A Gentile becomes a Christian. Well, how Jewish do they have to be? Do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to wear Jewish clothing? Do they have to eat Jewish food? Do they have to observe Jewish holidays? On and on and on. And, of course, Paul is going to say, no, no, and no. No, Gentiles don't have to go through any of those Jewish hoops to become Christians. But there was definitely a group of Jewish Christians who said, oh yeah, Gentiles can become Christians as soon as they become Jews first. And that was a debate early on. But Paul here is just saying, if you're Jewish and you're a Christian, then stay Jewish. If you're a Gentile and you're a Christian, stay a Gentile. He says that's unimportant. Jew and Gentile is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each one should remain in the situation which he was in when God called him. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who is a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers, each man, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation God called him to. Again, this is we're in the last days thinking. Now's not the time to change. Now's the time to just stay in whatever situation you're in. Paul is criticized, and Christianity is criticized for, in a different letter where Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. It says, see, the Bible endorses slavery. And that was used during the Civil War by Southern preachers to defend slavery. I quote Paul, slaves, obey your masters. Paul, the thought of a world without slavery in the first century would be like thinking of a world without water. A world without buildings. Slavery was such a given in culture that to imagine a world without it was pretty much unthinkable. There were millions and millions of slaves in the Roman Empire. And, there was no such thing as a movement to abolish it or rid the world of slavery in the first century. It was like saying, let's rid the world of grass, or, it just was not even beyond the ability to think about such a world. Now here he says, if you have the opportunity to get your freedom, please do so. Please go for it. But Paul is criticized for not being a abolitionist. But you might as well say that Paul could be criticized for, not being pro-electricity. It's so far out of the realm of that era as to be not even conceivable. But he says, even if you're free, if you're not a slave, you're a slave to Christ. In other words, you belong to him. Because, of course, we use the word slave. This word slave has such a negative connotation, and it should. But when he says you're a slave of Christ, it just means you belong to him. That's what a slave did. A slave belonged to his or her master. Well, we all belong to Christ. The word in the New Testament that when Paul talks about himself is doulos. It means slave. But often modern translations translate it as servant. Just because the word slave is such a word that just hurts our ears. But the word in Greek is better translated slave. We are slaves of Christ. In other words, we belong to him. Now this next section is frankly kind of puzzling here, and scholars have a lot of different opinions about this next little part. Now about virgins. This is 25. I have no command from the Lord. Again, so he's differentiating his opinion from what he sees as what God is. I have no command from the Lord. But I give a judgment as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. Like, I know a thing or two. Because of the present crisis, the imminence of the Lord's return, it's going to happen any time. We're living on borrowed time. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you married? Don't seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Don't look for a wife. If you do marry, you've not sinned. If a virgin marries, she hasn't sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want you to spare you this. Again, man, What a ringing endorsement of marriage there. Those of you who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. I don't know, you should read that at every wedding. You know, what's our passage for the wedding? Well, let's read 1 Corinthians 7. You'll face many troubles. And of course, there's some truth in that. Marriage sometimes is work. Marriage is not always easy. What I mean, brothers, is the time is short. So see, this is why it's so obvious that what he's getting at here. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they have none. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. So it's this idea of don't get entangled in things because, you get married and then next week Jesus is coming. So he again, not a ringing endorsement of marriage. And then he kind of goes on, he kind of doubles down on this. I'd like for you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you might live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. You can see here why our friends in the Catholic Church lift up celibacy as the ideal. Why they see it as a requirement for their clergy, why the monastic movement, took off of monks and nuns and etc. That here Paul is really lifting up this what he sees as a better way, but that's greatly colored by the times that they're living in. Let's kind of finish this because this next paragraph is again a little puzzling. If anyone thinks he's acting improperly towards the virgin he's engaged to, and if she's getting along in years, and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who's made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right. He who doesn't marry her does even better. And part of this is, again, reading between the lines and also, from some historical sources and scholars who've done a whole lot more study in this than I have. There was a faction in the Corinthian church that felt that even married couples should abstain from any physical relationship because celibacy was this higher calling. And here we got an engaged couple, and he's saying, well, maybe you should just put it off, just don't go through with it because we're living in crisis time is short. But again, he says, but if you got to get married, go ahead and get married. This whole chapter is not, as I say, not exactly the most delightful exploration of the joys of marriage. He finishes off by saying, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If her husband dies, she's free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In other words, you might be married to a non-Christian, but if he dies, you need to marry a Christian. In my judgment, she's happier if she stays as she is. In other words, a widow. And I think I too have the Spirit of God. In other words, I think I know something. In other words, this is not from God. This is not God's command, but this is what I think. This is what I think. Now, again, slight side trail here, but I think it helps us, especially as Protestants, understand some things, especially about our Catholic friends, their understanding of one, the priesthood, the celibacy of priests, and the whole idea of the monastic movement, nuns, monks, etc., the celibacy there. For the first 300 years of Christianity, Christian pastors were married. The celibacy does not go back all the way to the first century. Celibacy slowly, in the 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, celibacy becomes more and more prevalent among clergy. And of course, this is before there's a Protestant Reformation, so we're talking about what we would today probably call Catholic, although until there's a split, there's really not any denomination, it's just Christianity. But there becomes a movement towards a celibate priesthood, 4th century, 5th century. And a lot of that, the person we have to thank for that is St. Augustine. Some people say Augustine, and are you familiar with the name at all? St. Augustine, St. Augustine, who that is? St. Augustine, and I've said this in other studies probably, and maybe sermons too, St. Augustine, or St. Augustine, is the most influential Christian writer ever outside of the biblical writers. Other than the actual biblical authors, Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, is the most influential Christian theologian and writer in the history of Christianity. More so than Martin Luther, or John Calvin, or John Wesley, or Billy Graham, or C.S. Lewis, or anybody else you can think of as an influential Christian writer and leader. St. Augustine is the most influential Christian writer and theologian and bishop ever. And his thinking and teachings continue to influence the Catholic Church in a huge way. And not to go down too much of a side trail, but Augustine, St. Augustine, was a very secular man and was a young man who had a very sort of wild young adulthood and went from one woman to the next, and they would sowed his wild oats, or however you want to call it, was very promiscuous in his relationships with women. And he had a mother, though, who was a Christian, and she continually prayed for him. She continually prayed for him to become a Christian. For years, for decades, she prayed for him. Finally, one day, and he had explored different religions and finally one day, he picked up Christian scriptures, and this is in the 4th century, picked up Christian scriptures and began to read, and he felt God telling him to read this and he became a follower of Christ. And he very quickly went from a non-believer to a Christian to a priest to a bishop. I mean, really quickly, from non-believer to bishop in North Africa, very quickly. And he looked back at his former life of promiscuity with horror, with horror about the life he had led. And he wrote many Christian books that are classics of Christian thought. One called The City of God, one called Confessions, etc. And in these books, he is the one responsible, basically, for making sex sinful. I mean, his teachings are what really put a sense that there was something just not right, something that was original sin, something that was just wrong with sex. Because he said that before, and again, I'm going to get a little, not real graphic, but slightly, I can't talk about Augustine without talking about what he said. he said that before Eve ate the fruit, before the fall, that procreation, making children, involved no lust at all, no desire at all. But he said after the fall, the only way to procreate is for the man to feel lust, because an erection requires lust. So he taught that any form of sexual arousal was sin, and that the only excuse for ever having sex was to make children. That's the only thing that the only reason you should ever have sex is to perhaps produce a child. So he was totally against sex for anything other than making babies. Now you think about modern Catholic teaching, and you draw a line from St. Augustine to the present. What is considered sin still to this day in the Catholic Church? Birth control. Artificial birth control. To this day, artificial birth control. The pill, condom, whatever. To this day, in Catholic teaching, artificial contraception is sin. In Catholic teaching. Now, big swaths of Catholic folks don't follow that. And you say, well, why? Why do Catholics oppose contraception? Because the only reason to have sex is to make a child. And any other use of sex for pleasure is sin. And that goes back to Augustine. That goes back to St. Augustine. Now, obviously, we Protestants, and probably a lot of Catholics, would say Augustine was dead wrong. That when God wired us and made us, that is a very warped and wrong understanding of human sexuality. But from the time of Augustine until now, there have been thousands of books written on how St. Augustine forever kind of messed up the Christian understanding of sex, and how we view sexuality, because of Augustine saying that other than making a child, any lust is sin. And by lust he means, arousal of any kind. So anyway, probably more than you want to hear about that. But I'm just saying, it helps us to understand why we Protestants, and why Martin Luther, when Martin Luther didn't just object to the Catholic Church selling indulgences to cut your time off of your time in purgatory, Luther also thought that all the Catholic teaching about celibacy, the celibacy of the clergy, and all of that was all non-biblical. That's why Luther married a nun and they had 10 kids. Because he thought that Catholic understanding was totally wrong. Yeah, Larry.
Larry, what year did St. Augustine make this teaching, or his writing?
Early 400s. The early 400s. So he was born like in 360, 370, somewhere like that, and was Bishop of Hippo by around the year 400. And I couldn't tell you the exact, but it's approximately that time. End of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century is when he's doing that. Yeah.
Isn't this similar to what Paul is saying also?
Well, yeah, but I think Paul is not saying sex is evil or bad. I think he just says, Paul is saying celibacy is a higher calling. Because when you're celibate, you can be totally devoted to God and not be distracted by a wife or a husband. And so the Catholic Church definitely leans on this chapter for their ongoing teaching that priests have to be celibate. Which, I said, that doesn't go back to the early church. We know Peter was married. And Peter, in Catholic teaching, is the first pope. But we know Peter was married. And he had a mother-in-law. We know most clergy were married in... Matter of fact, when Paul writes his letters to Timothy, he says, if your desire is to be a pastor, you should only have one wife. I mean, in his instructions to pastors, he talks about them having wives. So, the preponderance of Scripture is that clergy should be married. That was certainly the Jewish rabbis definitely should be married. You couldn't be a rabbi if you were unmarried. So, anyway, now, you might think the next chapter is about as irrelevant as it could be, but it is incredibly, really relevant if you understand the underlying problem that Paul is addressing. Because chapter 8 is about a topic that you say, well, that has nothing to do with us. It is about food sacrificed to idols. So, let's read the first couple of sentences and then talk about the background of this chapter. Now, Paul says in chapter 8, now about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. But the man who loves God is known by God. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols. So, what is this about? Okay, we're the world of Corinth and the world of the whole Roman Empire. The Jews are not the only people who use animal sacrifice as an act of worship. When we read about the Old Testament, and we read about first the tabernacle, and then about the temple, Solomon's temple, etc. How do you worship God? Well, you bring your animal, your sheep, your goat, whatever. You bring it into the temple. This is in Judaism. You bring your animal into the inner court, the court of the priests. The priest, and there's lots of different kinds of offering. There's sin offering, there's thanksgiving offering, there's different kinds of offerings. The priest puts his hand on the animal's head, and if it's a sin offering, you confess your sin. The priest slits the throat of the animal. Blood pours out. Some of that blood will end up being put on the altar. Then the sacrifice is made. And what they would do, usually, they would just take a representative piece of the animal, like just some of the fatty portion. It would be burned on an altar in the court of the priests as a sacrifice to God. But they'd only burn a little piece of the animal, just a part of the animal. It was rare that they would burn up the entire animal. That was very rare. There was a special name when they'd burn up the whole animal as a sacrifice. That one was called a holocaust, when they would burn up the whole animal. So they would burn up a representative part of the animal. Then you still got a goat or a sheep or whatever you have. Part of that animal would then go to the priests as payment. Part of the animal you took with you to have a party, have a feast, have a whatever, have meat for your table. That's the way Judaism worked when you brought an animal for sacrifice. And that's the way it was working, including the time in Judaism at the time of Jesus. Why did Jesus get so mad at the sellers in the temple courts? Because they were selling animals at 3 and 4 times the going rate. Somebody would come with their goat or their sheep that they wanted to sacrifice in the temple. And the temple inspectors would go, oh, that's not good enough. It's got a blemish right here. It's got a little spot on it. Yeah, we can't use that animal. You can't use that to sacrifice to God. You got to buy one of these officially approved animals. And it's going to cost you 4 times what it's worth. And that's the animal that they would then have to use the approved animal. And that's why Jesus is so incensed, and he calls it a den of robbers because of how they're overcharging for the animals that they're selling in the temple courts to be used for sacrifice. So, animal sacrifice is a part of Judaism right up until the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. 70 AD, the Romans destroy the temple, the Jerusalem temple. And from 70 AD until today, the Jews have not resumed animal sacrifice. And Jewish worship shifted from the temple to the synagogue. The synagogue where the worship became about reading scripture and singing and praying and teaching, etc. The model for the church, basically. But before 70 AD, Jewish worship was focused on animal sacrifice in the temple. So you read about all that all through, but they weren't the only ones. Most religions involved animal sacrifice. Horribly, some religions involved child sacrifice. Some of the religions that the Jews encountered in Canaan, instead of sacrificing animals, they sacrificed their firstborn child on an altar. So Judaism never included that. Other religions did. But in the first century, animal sacrifice is a part of most religions, including the religions of the Roman Empire, the Greek and Roman culture. So there's a big temple there to Aphrodite in Corinth, and not only can you go there and partake of the sacred prostitutes, you can offer your animal sacrifice. And it's the same thing. You bring your animal, the priest of whoever, the priest of Zeus or Apollo or Aphrodite or Athena or whatever other god or goddess you were sacrificing to. They take a representative portion of the animal, burn it on the altar. The priest would take part of the animal as his payment. The worshiper would get the rest of the meat to take home, have a party, have a feast, throw a wedding feast or whatever. And so here's the question that Paul is approaching. Those priests, they got paid in meat. Well, they can't eat all that meat. What are they going to do with it? They're going to sell it. So it's a temple/butcher shop. I mean, you go to the temple to sleep with the prostitute, to sacrifice, or to buy meat. Okay? So that's where you buy your meat, because the priest can't possibly eat all that meat. So here's the question. I'm a Christian. I'm a new Christian. Last year, I used to sacrifice to Aphrodite or Apollo or Zeus or whoever. Last year, I used to bring my animal and sacrifice it to the pagan god. But now I'm a Christian. But I've got non-Christian friends there in Corinth, people I work with. And they say, hey, my daughter's getting married. Will you come to the wedding feast? Okay. And guess what's served at the wedding feast? The animal that was sacrificed to the pagan god. The meat that was used to worship Aphrodite or Apollo or Zeus. So the question is, if I'm a Christian, is it okay for me to eat the meat that was used to worship a pagan god? Is it okay for me to eat the meat that was used in a ritual sacrifice to Zeus? That's the question that the people in Corinth are asking. Can I eat that meat? Or if I want to have meat for my family, can I go buy it at the temple/butcher shop? Or if the neighbors invite us over for dinner and they put meat on the table, do I go, well, where'd this meat come from? Was it used in a pagan sacrifice? This is not anything that we really even have to think about. But it is a huge issue for the Corinthian Christians. Can I eat that meat? So what does Paul say? He says, yes, you can. No, that's right. He says, so then, about eating food sacrificed to idols. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world. There is no God but one. Even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, indeed there are many, quote, gods and many, quote, lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things come, and from whom we live, for whom we live. There is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came, and through whom we live. But not everybody knows this. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food doesn't bring us near to God. We're no worse if we don't eat, and no better if we do. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom doesn't become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone with a weak conscience sees you, who have this knowledge, eating in an idol temple, won't he be emboldened to eat what has been sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother, for whom Christ died, is destroyed by your knowledge. When you sin against your brothers in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I'll never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall. So, this is a kind of a complex argument. He says, because he's talking about there's knowledge and there's love. He says, you have knowledge. You know there is no Apollo. There is no Zeus. There is no Aphrodite. There is no Athena. There is no Mercury. I mean, those gods don't exist. They're not real. You know that. And meat is meat. It's just meat. It's not gonna help you or hurt you. It's just food. It's just fuel for your body. So eat it. It doesn't matter, he's saying. He says, you know that there's no problem with eating the meat because these gods don't exist. But your fellow Christian, who 6 months ago was a pagan, who was raised to worship Zeus and Apollo and Athena and Aphrodite and Mercury and blah, blah, blah. Your Christian brother or sister who just, 6 months ago was a pagan, if they see you eating this meat in the temple, in the temple of Aphrodite, they're going to go, what's going on over there? I thought he was a Christian and he's eating Aphrodite meat? And it's going to wound his or her conscience. It's going to confuse them. And what he seems like he's saying, which you can you're charging him with being a hypocrite or being he's basically saying, well, it's okay, but don't do it in front of him. Really. The meat, you can eat the meat, but if you eat the meat in front of your weaker brother or sister, you might wound their conscience. So refrain from eating it in front of them, because that could lead them down a negative path. Now, what do you think? What do you think about what Paul says here? I mean, obviously, it's not a temptation that we face, at least not this literal one.
It's like modern day, if something offends, like, you go to somebody's house and something that you do or eat or say would offend them, then you try not to offend them.
Okay, what would be one of those somethings?
Like, could be drinking, maybe they don't drink in their home, so you
Drink
should
what?
get a bottle of wine.
Okay.
You know.
Drinking alcohol.
Yeah, drinking alcohol.
Okay.
I think about the folks that are like going through recovery
Mm-hmm.
from alcoholism or
Right.
so especially sometimes conversion kind of accompanies that, let's say, journey to recovery. So, drinking in their presence as an unbeliever might cause them to stumble as well.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Whenever I teach on this chapter and I ask, is there a modern, analogy for, or, the one that everybody comes up first is alcohol. The first analogy that people come up with is alcohol. Is like, because some Christians, for a variety of reasons, choose not to drink alcohol, believe it is wrong to drink alcohol. Other Christians say, well, hey, Jesus made like gallons and gallons of wine. I mean, Jesus drank. So drink in moderation. The Bible definitely condemns being drunk, but the Bible does tell us that Jesus drank wine. Now, Janine and I don't drink, mainly because you've heard me say Janine's father was an alcoholic. And just that forever kind of made us just decide we're just not ever going to drink. But I don't have trouble with other people who drink. I don't have any trouble with anybody, as long as they're of age and they're not drinking to excess. I don't have trouble with people drinking because Jesus drank. But it's, you can see, it's interesting that he says this, the difference between knowledge and love, because he's like, you have knowledge and you say, well, there's nothing wrong with eating this meat because we know those gods don't exist. So I know, my head knows there's no such thing as Aphrodite. So there's no trouble with me eating the meat. And he's like, yes, you have that knowledge and you're right, but the loving thing sometimes might be to refrain from eating that meat in front of a weaker brother, that it's going to wound their conscience. And that would be like what you're saying. You can say, well, Jesus drank wine, so why couldn't I drink wine? Well, there might be some people that it would not be wise to drink wine in front of them. When I was a brand new pastor, an older pastor told me, he said, if you're going to go see a movie that's anything other than G, you better drive 50 miles away to see it. He says, because, if some parishioner sees you going into an R-rated movie, it'll be all over town by the next day, Now that we stream, of course, all those things, those things are different now. But, the only time I've ever encouraged the whole church to go see an R-rated movie was The Passion of the Christ, which was an R-rated movie. But, so you could think of other things that you might, as a Christian, say, well, there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing biblically wrong with eating this, drinking this, doing this, dancing, playing cards, all those. There was lots of things that...
What about things like, and I know there are some, and I have friends who are of other religions who...
Other religions or other forms of Christianity?
Other forms of Christianity.
Okay.
Other forms of Christianity that are very opposed to things like Harry Potter books.
Mm-hmm.
These are of magic, and they are wrong, and they, you should not allow your child to read those, even though they are fictional stories.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
when Harry Potter...
Look at it, it's a
Oh, yeah.
fictional
Well, the
story.
first Harry Potter book came out, I think, in 2010. I think it's when the... No, that's not right. No, earlier than that. No. That's what I meant. I meant 2000. I'm only 10 years off. Yeah. Because, Patty, when the book came out, and Harry's 11 in the first book, Patty was 11. Patty was 11 in 2001. So, okay. So, 2000, 2001, somewhere in there. So, because Patty was always the same age as Harry Potter. I was pastor at Ada then, and the first Harry Potter book became a big phenomenon. And yeah, I had parents coming to me and saying, "Should my child be able to read Harry Potter?" You know, so I read Harry Potter. I mean, the only way I could give a truthful, opinion, I felt, before let my daughter read it or could give an opinion to parents, is for me to read the book. So I read the book, and I said, this is about as harmful as Bewitched. For those of you who remember, if you remember the old Bewitched TV show from the 60s.
I mean, you have Sleeping Beauty or any
Yeah.
Disney characters.
Yeah.
It's
Um,
a story.
Yeah, there was again when way back when I was brand new pastor, when I was an associate at Wesley. This is before Gina and I had children at all, so it was a real long time ago. Because Patty's 33. Before we had kids, and I was an associate pastor at Wesley Methodist in Oklahoma City. The choir director had a 5-year-old. He and his wife had a 5-year-old. And they had bought tickets to see He-Man live. You know who He-Man is? He-Man was a toy craze in the 80s. And he's still around. He-Man is a toy craze from the 80s. And, they have these shows, like live, SpongeBob Live or, Blue's Clues Live or whatever, Disney on Ice or those kind of things, right? So this would be He-Man, because he was a big He-Man fan. But there's magic in He-Man. Anyway, they had tickets to go see He-Man live. And then the night, or about a week before He-Man live, the mom got a call from Miss America. Who happened to be Miss Oklahoma, but also now is Miss America, and asked if the mom would accompany her in a concert. You get a call from Miss America. It's hard to say no. So they said to Larry and Janine, would you take our little boy Brady to He-Man Live so that she can play piano for Miss America? And we're like, okay. So Janine and I took Brady to He-Man Live. And as we are walking into Oklahoma City, wherever it was, at the fairgrounds, or wherever it was in Oklahoma City, there are protesters outside the arena from a church, and protesting the He-Man was magic and evil and satanic, and they had a brochure that was called Terror in the Toy Box. And it was about all of the cartoons that involved magic and how they were all satanic. And the one that really took the cake for me was the one that was satanic was the Care Bears. Do you remember the Care Bears, anybody? That the Care Bears were satanic. Because there's magic in the show. All that to say, I think, are there occult things out there? Are there demonic occult things out there? Yeah, there definitely are occult stuff out there that is dangerous and bad and evil and wrong. I mean, there definitely is stuff that anybody and everybody should stay away from. I have a friend who was involved in the occult before he was saved. I mean, anyway, yeah. But, I think it's like anything. You have to, I'm always suspicious of anybody who criticizes or whatever protests against a book or a movie that they haven't seen or read.
Some families don't do Halloween.
Yeah.
I know a family who doesn't do Santa.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you rearrange the letters of Santa and you get Satan. So.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
People like to take a long stretch of a lot of things. I think.
Yeah.
Like you say, they don't understand.
Yeah. Well, not so much in my lifetime, but I know a little earlier day yeah, in some denominations, playing cards was sin. Yeah, dancing was sin, etc. When I was pastor in Ada, we were next door to the Baptist church. I mean, First Baptist and First Methodist were just separated by an alleyway. And in a town like Ada, on Friday night after the football game, the teenagers are looking for something to do, and you want to provide a good alternative for the teenagers to doing something they shouldn't be doing. And so our church and the Baptist church, we did what was called fifth quarter, and they had free pizza, and we had a dance. And the kids would go get pizza at the Baptist church, and then they'd come across the alley, and they'd go to the dance at our church. But because the Baptist church said dancing was sinful. Matter of fact, again, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but the senior pastor at the Baptist church when I was there, and he was the age then that I am now. I mean, I was in my 30s. He was probably at least in his 50s, if not older. He had gone on a conference and stayed at a hotel with his wife of 20 plus years. And downstairs they had a little, restaurant that had little like ballroom dancing or like, big band dancing, like, this kind of dancing. And that pastor danced with his wife at that hotel. And he had to publicly apologize to his congregation for doing it. He had to apologize to the congregation for dancing with his wife of 20 plus years. This kind of stuff. Anyway, but not to be slamming the Baptists, but but anyway, so as I say, this chapter 8 is a very nuanced kind of chapter in a lot of ways. But he says, you may know there's nothing wrong with it, but don't drag somebody else who has a weaker conscience into sin because of your, so I think, yeah. I mean, obviously, so if you have a friend who's like, an alcoholic, you're not going to drink in front of them. At least I hope you're not going to, or those kinds of things. I mean, and maybe if you have somebody who is hypersensitive about Harry Potter, if their child comes over to your house, that's not the movie you're going to play while they're there, But and other situations like that.
I think isn't it more of being respectful of other people's feelings and beliefs? I mean, at least for me, the lady that I worked with, she was very opposed to all this. And, I mean, it was just, I just felt it was, okay, you have yours and I have mine, and I will respect yours and you can respect mine.
There was in Ada, there was a family in the church who they were reading Harry Potter in class at the high school or the middle school, I can't remember which, and they pulled their daughter out of class. They were not going to let her be subjected to Harry Potter. As I say, but it's funny that the stronger Christians are eating the meat sacrificed to idols. And the weaker Christians are the ones who aren't, because at first glance you would think, well, it would be the stronger Christians who would refrain. No, the stronger Christians are like, nothing wrong with this meat. There's no such thing as these other gods. It's the weaker Christians who refrain from it. So, I don't really want to jump into the next chapter because that's a whole other kettle of fish. So, any more comments, questions about marriage or meat?
It seems to be more judgmental, maybe some people are just more judgmental, and I would see them as maybe weaker because they're not loving everybody. They're judgmental if they have, a tattoo or a nose ring or, wear shorts and flip-flops to church or,
Yeah, someone has said, I was reading somebody's commentary on the fall, and in the garden with Adam and Eve. And if you read it really carefully, God says, "Don't eat that fruit. Right? Don't eat that fruit from that one tree." And then Satan says, Did God really say you can't eat any fruit in this whole garden? Which, of course, is a lie. And then, if you read cleverly, what does Eve say? Eve says, "No, we're not allowed to eat that fruit or even touch it." Did God say that? No. She made the rule stricter than God. God said, "Don't eat it." Satan says, or the serpent says, "Is it really you can't eat any fruit?" No. God says we can't eat it or touch it. So she made the rule harsher than God. And this commentator says that was really the fall right there, where she piled on additional things to God's law, which is what the Pharisees did. I mean, that's what the Pharisees did. The Pharisees added all this extra stuff that you couldn't do. And that's why Jesus was so bugged by them. Because the Pharisees weren't just following, like when it came to the Sabbath, It's real simple. On the Sabbath day, rest. Take a day off. That's the Sabbath. Rest, worship. They're like, okay, you can't lift more than the weight of a fig. You can't draw water from a well. You can't tie this kind of knot. I mean, on and on and on and on. They kept piling on all these additional rules. And that's why Jesus was so incensed with them. It wasn't that they were being lax with God's laws. They were just kept adding on to him and adding on to him and adding on to him. Nowhere does it say that I can find, don't dance in the Bible. But our Southern Baptist friends somehow think it's there somehow. We have scriptures where people do dance. David danced before the Ark of the Covenant. When they brought the Ark back into town, David was dancing for the Lord. I don't find anywhere in the Bible it says dancing is forbidden. But somehow the Southern Baptist folks, well, it must be in there somewhere. Anyway, so, Paul, we're free, but we also have to be, we don't use our freedom in an abusive way. And that's, it's simpler if it's all just, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But Paul says we're free, we have a freedom in Christ, but you don't use your freedom to be, to do things that you know are unhealthy and harmful to yourself or your neighbor. So, anyway. He's going to go on a rant in the next chapter about kind of his own place as an apostle, and he's a little incensed in chapter 9, and he kind of has a right to be. But you see in this whole letter, Paul's personality really is coming through. The letters of Paul are very personal letters, and they're dealing with very specific congregations. And sometimes he says, this is a word from the Lord, and sometimes he says, this is my opinion. And when you really read it carefully, you kind of see that. So, well, let's pray. Lord, once again, grateful for your sustaining grace, grateful for the words of Jesus that are always our guideposts when it comes to every situation about loving you, loving our neighbor, and being always leading with grace. We ask that you guide us and help us to be a grace-filled people, a resurrection people, Easter people each and every day. Amen.